I mean, right now it's an incredible inflection point. We have uh, over 2.5 million business owners, nearly 3 million business owners who are over 55
Yeah.
here in the United States. And I'm talking about like privately held local businesses that are a vital part of our economy. And many of those owners right now are thinking, what am I going to do for my succession plan? I think will become very important to our economy, but also they'll become very important for attracting talented people to your company. When they say, okay, I can go to this company that's trust owned and they have a track record of, caring about their employees in this really holistic way. Like that's very appealing.
And get behind something that's bigger than just accumulating money and revenue, and just get behind something that potentially has an impact on the world. Hey, welcome to this week's episode of The Freedom Experience. I'm your host, John Moncrief. And today I'm speaking to Peter Koehler, who's the founder of the Lumo Group and a passionate advocate for mission-driven business ownership. So Peter shares his journey from navigating the challenges of venture capital in a startup to pioneering alternative ownership models like Perpetual Purpose Trusts and employee ownership trusts. And I'm finding this a really exciting space at the moment because I think alternative ownership structures bring creative options to business owners of purpose-driven companies. If you're an owner who wants more than just a big payday, if you want to give back, if you want to stay involved in the business beyond that exit or transition, and you want to keep that sense of community, then I think these are ideal structures. So in this episode, we explore the differences between ESOPs, EOTs, and PPTs, and how these structures align with ownership and purpose. We also talk about some of the pitfalls of scaling too fast with venture capital and how that can clash with a company's mission and vision. And we talk about how businesses can create enduring legacies that prioritize employees, community, sustainability, while still maintaining independence. So if you're curious about how alternative ownership structures can transform businesses and preserve your sort of core mission and what you want to achieve with your business and your legacy, then this is the conversation you want to be listening to. So grab a pen, grab a piece of paper. We cover a lot here, and I hope you enjoy it. Peter, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for taking the time to help us out with this really interesting topic that I think a lot of business owners are kind of grappling with at the moment.
I'm super happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So how did you find your way? I'm curious about how you found your way into helping business owners kind of navigate setting up employee ownership trusts and employee perpetual trusts, and how you find yourself where you are now.
Yeah, so I started my private sector life in the startup world. And I worked for a startup. It was actually a healthy convenience store concept, kind of like Whole Foods meets 7-Eleven. And this was, back in the early 2010s. And we raised a bunch of money to scale this concept. And when I got there, there was one store. And by the time I left, there was 4 stores, all in the Portland, Oregon area. But the vision was, 50 stores.
Yeah.
But when I was there, it became clear that the best way to grow this sort of business was actually at odds with the goals of the capital that we had raised. So these investors came in and they had this vision of what they thought growth should look like for us. And we tried to keep up with that vision. We tried to, be rolling out a couple stores every year, but we realized that was actually not a sustainable path for the business. And so along the way, we ended up having to raise more money than we anticipated, diluting other investors, diluting the founders. We were spread too thin, and we were growing faster than we should have been. And ultimately, it didn't work out. The business kind of treaded water for a while, and then eventually it shut down, it ran out of money. And through that experience, I saw firsthand, and I learned what it means to take on capital, ownership, shareholders that kind of are at odds with the actual core purpose of the business. And the core purpose of this business was bringing healthy food to every neighborhood.
Gotcha.
But
Yeah.
we didn't achieve that mission because we tried to scale too fast. We tried to, rather than serving the mission, we became servants to the venture capitalists who were investing in the business.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with venture capital. There's a time and a place for venture capital. And I'm not anti-venture in the right circumstance. But that experience for me personally made me interested in alternative ownership structures and alternative financing structures that would allow businesses to grow on their own terms and to persist in their independence and their mission.
Okay.
So I began kind of like consulting and knocking on doors of mission driven businesses to see how I could help. And I eventually got connected with a company in Oregon called Organically Grown Company, which is the largest independent distributor of organic produce in the country. And this was late 2017, and they were exploring something called a Perpetual Purpose Trust. And they said, you know what, we want to transition our company to a Perpetual Purpose Trust so that we can lock in our mission, lock in our independence, and we need help with that. And one of the things we need help with is raising money to help finance that transaction. I had a bunch of experience helping companies raise money, so they hired me. I helped them raise, millions of dollars to finance this transition, both debt and equity. And during that process, I got my 101 course in purpose trust ownership. And this was 2017. At this time, this was pretty new in the United States. And this was the largest transition that had happened to date, because it's a pretty big company. So after we did that, we got some news, we got some press, and all of a sudden these other businesses started knocking on our door. And they say, hey, that's really cool what you did. Could you help us do the same thing? So we said, sure. And we set up a little consultancy called Alternative Ownership Advisors. And we started helping these businesses. And that's what I did for about 5 years. And then about a year and a half ago, Alternative Ownership Advisors, we dissolved it for kind of certain practical reasons. And I set up my own shop, Lumo Group, where I'm continuing that work, helping companies explore and implement alternative ownership solutions with an emphasis on purpose trusts and employee ownership trusts.
So if we go back to what you're saying about venture capital and the business that you were involved in at that time, did you folks, were you clear on the purpose of the business that when you took on the venture funding, or was that something that came afterwards, just as a matter of kind of curiosity more?
Yeah, no, it was clear from the beginning. The owner and the founder, she was very mission-driven person, and she wrote her mission statement before anything else. And when we were raising the money, we thought that it would help us achieve our mission, more quickly. But we failed to foresee some of the kind of downsides and pressures that money would put on us. And that is what led to the situation that the company ended up being in.
Just a sort of follow on for that. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit before we've kind of dived into the differences between these structures, but is there, because you raise or have experience raising money for these types of businesses, is there the opportunity to kind of set up a perpetual trust from day one with kind of a startup in mind and then raise capital in that way?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say that, the most common archetype of clients, companies that want to do this, are more mature companies who are looking for a succession plan. That founder is, later career, 50s, 60s, they want to retire, or they want to really step back from their day-to-day business. And they're looking for a way to, replace themselves essentially as the owner. And of course they have all the conventional options, sell their business, private equity, strategic acquisition. But this is kind of another alternative. I would say that's 75% of the companies we work with are in that boat. Okay. But to your question, there's this other 25%. And many of these are earlier stage companies. And we get this question a lot. I'm just starting out. Should I start a purpose trust? And my answer is, it depends. If you're not planning on raising capital like now or anytime soon, and you're just starting out, there's not necessarily a reason for you to start or for you to set up a purpose trust at this point, because what a purpose trust is essentially you're setting up a steward owner.
Okay.
But if you're just a solo founder or like a co-founder and you own 100% of your business, you are the steward. Like you're doing what the trust would do, and you can do it in a less administratively complex way. You don't need to worry about the administration and expense of a trust at this juncture. Maybe down the road, if that makes sense. But if you're planning on raising capital, and that you have kind of a long-term purpose that you want your company to adhere to, and maybe you have long-term goals around the independence of your company, then prior to that capital raise, I think it's worth considering setting up a purpose trust. Maybe not as a 100% shareholder, but as a partial shareholder, just to put that flag in the ground, that stake in the ground that says this is what we're about. As an investor, this is what you're signing up for. This is the structure you're coming into, and this is very clear and transparent, so that everybody's on the same page. From the beginning.
Yeah. Okay, get it. Makes sense. So if we step back, the ESOPs have been around for a long time, and I think I probably first really got in touch with them through people like Jack Stack and Great Game of Business and Small Giants Community and all that sort of thing. But along the way, the term employee or EOTs and PPTs are coming up. So I guess the first question I've got is, what's the difference between these structures, and particularly sort of an EOT and a PPT? So for the audience, it's a perpetual purpose trust and an employee ownership trust. And how do you differentiate those two? Or this?
Great question. So, I'll be speaking, unless I state otherwise, I'll be speaking in the U.S. legal context.
Sounds good. Yeah.
But different, like the UK, Canada, like they have some slightly different rules. But generally speaking, in the U.S., there's a legal form called a Perpetual Purpose Trust, and the two keywords to focus on are perpetual and purpose. Okay, so this is key, perpetual. So that's key because you're replacing a mortal human owner with an immortal perpetual owner, right? And the immortal perpetual owner never wants to sell the company, and never wants to take a dividend, and never wants to extract value. It's also important because not all trusts are perpetual. Like different types of trusts under law, some are 50 years, some are 99 years, but this one's actually perpetual, just persists forever. The other keyword is purpose. So many people are probably familiar with like family trusts or charitable trusts, where there's like a clear beneficiary that says, oh, my child is the beneficiary, or this charity is the beneficiary. But the purpose trust statute in U.S. law is actually quite broad, and essentially the purpose or the beneficiary can be a purpose, so to speak. There's some debate in the legal community about like what exactly that means, but basically you can have this broadly defined purpose, and that purpose can include certain stakeholders. So an employee ownership trust is not actually separate from a purpose trust. What it is it's just a purpose trust where the purpose is employee benefit, essentially.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so employee ownership trust is like it's kind of like a marketing term for an employee-focused and employee-centered perpetual purpose trust.
So we've got a perpetual purpose trust, and then an employee ownership trust is set up is a perpetual purpose trust set up for the employee. That's specific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So legally, it's the same thing. Employee ownership trust is kind of the marketing term, so people kind of know what you're talking about. I actually, even though employee ownership trust has caught on, I prefer the term employee-centered purpose trust. I think it's more clear, or an employee benefit trust, because employee ownership trust connotes that like the employees maybe own stock in the company, where they actually don't. The purpose trust is the stockholder, but it exists to serve and benefit the employees.
Gotcha. Okay.
So a little in the weeds, but that's the 101 on those two terms.
But a very good distinction there as well, because it is it can be confusing. And
Yeah.
so I guess the sort of follow-on question from that is how does that differ from an ESOP? Because then an ESOP is a stock ownership plan, or the
Yep.
employees do actually own
Yes.
stock.
So in an employee stock ownership plan, an ESOP, which is the most popular form of employee ownership in the United States, there's a trust, not to be confused with like a purpose trust, but like a trust that holds stock on behalf of these employees. But essentially, the employees are, they own the stock directly. There's just like a custodian essentially that takes care of it. And the stock that's held by by these employees, it lives in essentially a retirement account. And if the employee leaves the company or dies, then the company now is on the hook to pay out the value of that employee's ESOP account to the employee. The one very important distinction about ESOPs versus EOTs and purpose trusts. Well, there's a couple key distinctions, but one is that ESOPs are regulated by the IRS, by ERISA. And ERISA is, I always forget what it stands for. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And so it's this regulated thing. And because of that, there's a lot of administrative complexity that you have to adhere to by law. And but kind of the trade-off is that you also get some tax benefits for being owned by an ESOP. If you're like a ESOP owned S Corp, for example, then if certain conditions are met, then you are not subject to income tax, for example. And selling owners who sell to an ESOP may be able to defer some of their capital gains. So there's
tax benefits there, but then you have kind of the government being more involved in the administration of the business to protect the employees.
Not like they're not involved, but they have oversight. And there are rules you have to follow that are very strict and burdensome depending on kind of the size of the business. The other key distinction is that a ESOP is purpose agnostic. An ESOP doesn't care about mission or purpose. What an ESOP cares about is maximizing the value of the ESOP. And so if you have a ESOP that owns the majority of a company, 51% or more, then the fiduciary, the trustee who kind of manages that ESOP on behalf of all those employees, they have a fiduciary obligation to maximize the ESOP, which means if there is an unsolicited acquisition offer that comes their way, and they say, hey, we want to buy your company, and we know it's worth roughly $20 a share, but we're willing to pay $24 a share, then the ESOP trustee might have to say, well, that's my fiduciary obligation to say yes. And now the company is sold, and maybe it's sold to a strategic acquirer that is going to ship those jobs out of that local community, or maybe they're going to destroy the sustainable supply chain that company had built. And so in that sense, an ESOP doesn't really, if you care about like ongoing independence and purpose, you might think twice about some of the downsides of an ESOP.
So going back to what we were talking about before we hit the record button, part of this process, I imagine, as the owner, is being very clear on what you want out of this transaction, or out of I suppose if you are looking for something that's going to be around in perpetuity, then, and there's a clear purpose, then you're looking toward a employee trust. Whereas if you are looking to look after your employees and just make sure that they, at the end of the day, are well looked after and have a sort of piece of the pie, then you're perhaps looking toward an ESOP. And maybe that's oversimplified.
I would say maybe I would say yes, oversimplified, because both ways, employees can get looked after, um, but you're absolutely 100% right. It all comes down to, like, what are your design requirements as an owner?
Yeah.
And so, like, that's the first thing we do with any person is we try to deeply understand, okay, what are your goals? What are your objectives? Like, what design requirements should we adhere to? And, uh, and then, so, like, when it comes to employee benefit, for example, an ESOP is nice because there's some, uh, uh, you get some of the savings from the tax uh, relief that you can then pass on to your employees. But the way that those employees accrue wealth is in a retirement account.
Yeah.
Whereas in an employee ownership trust, often the most common way to share with your employees is with real time profit sharing.
Okay.
And so we found, to, like, broadly generalize, that, for example, companies that have lower wage workers, like folks in the service industry, restaurant industry, warehousing, trucking, a lot of those employees, when you talk to them, they prefer real time profit sharing because they have a down payment they're saving up for now. They have a kid who's going to college next year. Like, they have needs now, and, well, like, employee growing their retirement account is nice. Um, it's not a luxury kind of everyone has when they have, like, real expenses this year. Um, Whereas an ESOP, it might be a little more appealing to higher wage workers, white collar workers who, are happy to just throw an extra tens of thousands of dollars a year into an account that they won't be able to touch for another couple decades.
Until they leave the business, or ultimately the
Right.
business is sold, or
Yeah.
however that sort of transpires.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh,
I get the key thing is actually sitting down with somebody like yourself and sort of having that conversation about, this is where I'm at the moment. These are potentially the fears that I have down
mhm.
the line in terms of, I suppose, change or having some flexibility. These are my goals. This is what I'm looking to achieve, and then being
Yeah.
guided by you through the process.
Yeah. Hopes and dreams on one side, fears and concerns on the other side. And then also, when people come to us, like, they come to us because they're like, oh, I want to do an ownership transition. But when we start talking, like, what you have to realize is it's not just an ownership transition. I like to think of it as 5 separate transitions. So there's ownership, there's a financial transition, there's a legal transition, like maybe the structure of your company will go from an S corp to a C corp, or, human owned to trust owned. Uh, then you have a cultural transition, and the cultural transition is going to, like, affect everybody who works there. And then there's a leadership transition. And so, uh, when people are talking about an ownership transition, it's like, okay, do you mean that you want to transition your ownership? Do you also want to transition your leadership? If you're the acting CEO, when are you planning to step back from that? And what about the financial transition? Like, what are your personal goals in terms of the payout you need so you can enjoy your retirement? Do you need upfront liquidity? Can you get paid out over time? Um, and the cultural transition, like, how will, like, employees experience this? Like, how involved do we want to enroll them in this process of designing what their future will look like? And these are all questions that will be different for every person and every company, but they're important to kind of separate them out.
So if we took that first one, involving the employees and the design of the company, that's
Mhm.
sitting down with the employees in the business and potentially talking about what the purpose of the business is and how we protect that purpose going forward, and kind of having that conversation about how we make sure that endures.
Yeah. And so, exactly. And so, if you're setting up, one of the beautiful things about a purpose trust or an employee ownership trust is how flexible they are. So, for example, if you decide that it's important for you to have an employee voice in the governance of the trust, then when you're setting up your trust board, which we often call a trust stewardship committee, um, you could have a seat that is an employee seat that all employees can vote on a representative that will, like, represent the employee voice. Um, you don't have to have an employee seat. You could have, like, 5 different ad hoc seats. You can design it how you want, is the whole point. But often we work with clients and we will sit down with their key leaders, maybe a broader group of employees, to understand, how should governance work,
Yeah.
and who should the stakeholders be? Like, yeah, we want the stakeholders to be employees, but do we want any other stakeholders? And we've literally worked with companies who have run the gamut from no, only employees, that's like the only stakeholder group, to a very broad kind of definition of who our stakeholders are, including, we recently worked with one company, Biohabitats, a landscape sustainable engineering firm, who they have a seat for the earth on their trust stewardship committee, and they have like someone
Love it.
representing the
Okay.
they have someone
Actually,
representing the earth and like
okay.
the environment, like sitting in
Yeah.
on their trust stewardship committee, which was quite creative. So there's lots of ways you can think about it.
So I guess the next one that goes through my head is leadership and management. And so once you go through this transition, running a business and growing a business is hard enough as it is. How does the kind of management or the operations of this business and the leadership team, how does that get structured? Is it sort of business as usual, or is it more intricate?
Yeah. So I think that if you're going through a succession plan, the leadership transition can be one of the hardest things to figure out, especially if you're like if you're the founder and you've been leading the company for a long time. Kind of filling those shoes and filling that vision can be daunting. So there's nothing different about a purpose trust ownership structure, except that it puts a little more responsibility on the company to figure it out for themselves. Because if you go and get acquired by a strategic acquirer or private equity, like they have their own leadership. Like they can install a new CEO, or maybe you'll just be acquired by a company that will just integrate you. And it can, and so that actually can be one of the things that's appealing about selling your company in a more conventional route, is like you don't have to think about the leadership succession planning part as much. But if you're going to do a trust ownership transition, which is essentially committing to self-ownership in perpetuity, then obviously it's all on you to figure it out. And we've worked with clients where they have been in this situation, and often one thing that we advise is to get that leadership succession plan, if not totally nailed down, like get it in motion prior to executing this trust transition, so that you can focus, you can like relieve yourself of that thing and then like focus just on the ownership piece. But the other key thing is, like, if you're going to bring in a new CEO or a new leader, it's really nice having them involved in the actual transition process, so that they're kind of enrolled and bought into kind of helping design this new ownership structure. So we've worked with clients where we actually help, we help them recruit a new CEO, go through a hiring process. And we do that in parallel. So it's like we bring on the CEO right around the time they're doing the transition. So it's kind of it's all one thing.
So we go through the transition and we're involved in sort of picking that leadership team, assembling the leadership team, finding the CEO, and that team performs well. How's that team, who's sort of making the decisions on who's on leadership teams and who's off leadership teams going forward? I suppose the thought that jumps to mind is in the UK, one of the popular kind of employee-owned businesses, I guess, is John Lewis.
Yep.
And, last year, 235 million loss, 11,000 people laid off. And I think the question really is, over time, who's actually making the decisions on who the leadership of the company is once you've gone through that initial transition?
Yeah. So in that sense, although there are a few ways you can set it up, it runs pretty much the same as a typical company, where you have the leaders of the company, the CEO specifically, reporting up to a board of directors,
Gotcha.
board of directors of the company. Now, Now, in a more conventional setup, the board of directors would be responsible to the shareholders. But in a trust-owned company, the shareholders is just the trust, right? The trust
Yeah.
is the shareholder. So it's kind of like company reports up to the board of directors, and then the board of directors reports up to the trust.
Okay.
And so the trust is ultimately has the authority to say hire and fire the board, maybe, but the board is the one that is like is going to be overseeing the CEO, hire and fire the CEO. So that's the most conventional
Okay.
setup, and typically the trust, because they're like a purpose-driven owner, they're not actively involved in the day-to-day management of the company, but they can step in if needed to like assert their muscle and assert their authority.
Okay.
So the trust will be getting regular updates. They'll be, looking at the quarterly updates on purpose and financials. And hopefully most of the time they're like, great, thumbs up, keep doing your thing.
Yeah.
But if needed, they could step in and say, you know what, we need to clean house a little bit and get things back on track.
Okay. And then presumably within the trust, there's some sort of definition on how the board is formed or who's on the board, and potentially if it's
Yep.
a
So
representative from the family or something.
exactly. So, and that's where I was
Okay.
talking about before. You could have an employee seat. You could do it however you want. Most commonly, we see 3 to 7 board seats on the trust stewardship committee, and those 3 to 7 seats maybe serve 4-year terms, maybe staggered terms, so you don't have turnover all at once. And they range from like totally like self-nominating to like a more formal process where stakeholders can nominate and vote on those seats.
Okay. And if I'm coming from a structure of a LLC, does that need to be converted to a C corp or?
Yeah, good question. So typically, yes. If you have a plain old vanilla LLC, technically you could have a trust own that LLC or partially own that LLC. However, an LLC, of course, is a pass-through tax entity. And so any positive net income, any profit, that tax liability would flow up to the trust, and trusts are taxed at the highest tax rate. So they have the worst tax treatment, like, of anything. So you want to avoid income flowing up to the trust if you can.
Gotcha. Okay.
So for that reason, we typically advise to not have a pass-through entity below the trust. An S corp, which is also a pass-through entity, a LLC taxed as an S corp, that they're actually not even allowed to have a purpose trust as a shareholder.
So you'd have to convert to a C corp.
Yeah. So I would say that we work with a lot of S corps because it's kind of an appealing form for these small, medium-sized businesses, and they have to convert to a C corp, which has its pros and its cons. But one of its pros in this structure is that the tax liability will stop at the C corp level, and no income will flow up to the trust.
Okay. It's one of the other things I was really curious about in the conversation you had with, I think, Jay Goltz on 21 Hats.
Yeah.
He talked about, there's a conversation about financing the business, and if the trust needed to raise capital from a bank or needed a line of credit or whatever it is, what happens if you go through this transaction and the corporation or the company has, for instance, a line of credit or whatever it is with the surety being signed by the owner, and that person dies along the way? Does that, and the bank calls it in, is the whole thing going to collapse or implode? Or, I mean, I'm not talking up maybe so well after the process, but what are the implications with those kind of things?
Well, so if your business is not at the point where it can kind of get its own bank financing, and the owner is still kind of co-signing or kind of pledging their own assets, their personal assets, in order to get that line of credit or that bank loan, that does make things a little more tricky. And moving to trust ownership is not going to necessarily kind of solve that problem. Like, the bank is still gonna, if they weren't gonna underwrite a loan before without your without you co-signing it, like they're probably not going to underwrite a loan now without you
Yeah.
co-signing it, or without someone co-signing it. And um, there are some exceptions. So we have, for example, in organically grown companies transition, we brought on a lot of debt to help finance that transition. And the lender that we worked with, they ended up being satisfied with a pledge of the company's stock as
Okay.
collateral so that they could take over the company if needed. A lot of banks, I would say, aren't really interested in that because they're not in the business of running companies. They don't want to be in the business of running companies. But it does happen from time to time. So you have to kind of make a decision as an owner. Am I willing to continue to underwrite these things even as I extract myself from the other parts of the business? Or if not, then what are my options? And the options are basically, okay, make the business financeable by improving its balance sheet and its performance. A. B, have someone else underwrite the loans. Like maybe some of the new employees, can be co-owners alongside the trust. So give them some skin in the game in a more concrete sense, so that they're willing to take on a little more risk by doing things like co-signing. Or C, just, accept the fact that like your business might have to grow without, debt financing, at least for a while, until such time it's more financeable.
Okay. So ideally, as you're going into this, there may be, you may have sort of co-signed for certain things, but as you're going through this transition, you probably want to be gradually removing yourself from that and just making sure that the trust can stand by itself. And
a lot of owners we've worked with, they're willing to like do some sort of hybrid where they say, you know what, let's do this trust transition, and I'm willing to continue being a co-signer for like the next 5 years after the transition to give you an off ramp so that the company can like figure out how to get off this, how to like either self-finance a line of credit or, be more financeable or whatever the solution is. And so there might be a little runway that outgoing owner is willing to provide.
Okay. And then presumably actually financing this transaction, because you're essentially selling the business to the trust, and then the trust is someone going to raise the capital to do that. And that's obviously what you specialize in doing as well, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that the most common structure is a self-financed transaction where the owner plays that role of the bank, and there's a seller note so that the company pays back the owner over time from company cash flow. So company's worth $10 million and the owner says, you know what, I'll just take a 10-year note and you can pay me back $1 million a year from your cash flow plus interest. And by the end of 10 years, I'll be, fully paid out for today's valuation. But some owners want more liquidity up front or they want to de-risk. And so in that case, then yes, we sometimes bring in external debt or equity to help finance a portion of that transaction. So most common structure, fully self-financed, I would say. Second most common financing structure is a hybrid of self-financing and debt financing. So maybe 50-50, 50% from a bank, 50% the owner will finance the rest.
Okay. And then I guess this is very new at the moment, particularly in the US. So if I remember rightly, you mentioned around 50 odd businesses, I think the last time I spoke to you, that are using this approach or this alternative structure.
Exactly. It's been around forever in Europe in different incarnations, but it's a little more novel here in the States. And that 50 company number is about right.
I feel like there's a trend toward more purpose-driven businesses at the moment. I feel like it's been coming over the past 10 years. We read a lot about the number of businesses that may just kind of potentially close their doors instead of going to market. Yep. Are you feeling that there are more owners who are looking to have a business that endures longer and are looking for this sort of approach?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, right now it's an incredible inflection point. We have over 2.5 million business owners, nearly 3 million business owners who are over 55
Yeah.
here in the United States. And these are, I'm talking about like privately held local businesses that are a vital part of our economy. And many of those owners right now are thinking, what am I going to do for my succession plan? And most of them are not going to be uh, private equity material, even if they wanted to go that route. Like they wouldn't be private equity wouldn't be interested. Most of them, some of them might be able to find like strategic acquirers, but that's difficult. And I would say most of them, even if they don't think of themselves as like a mission-driven company, quote unquote, they are actually mission-driven companies, because when you ask them, about how much they care about their employees, about their wages and their benefits, about the if they give back to their local community,
Yeah.
the answers are often yes, yes, and yes. Like they care about those things and they go above and beyond on those fronts. And so they're purpose-driven, maybe not in their product or service. I mean, they could be making widgets or whatever, but in the way they operate. And that is what we find is these companies say, these leaders say, I would love this to persist, so that we can keep these jobs here in my hometown, and we can keep these employees employed in jobs that will be around and that are good jobs, and that are family friendly jobs, or however they set up their company. So I think that's definitely a growing interest, and I think it will be, if I'm making predictions about the next decade and the rise of automation and the rise of AI, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are going to be lost. And so those jobs that can be preserved in companies that care about their workers and care about these communities are going to become premium jobs to have. And businesses that set up ownership structures that allow those to persist in a more enduring way, I think will become very important to our economy, but also they'll become very important for attracting talented people to your company. When they say, okay, I can go to this company that's trust owned and they have a track record of, caring about their employees in this really holistic way, like that's very appealing. So,
and get behind something that's bigger than just accumulating money and revenue, and just get behind something that potentially has an impact on the world. There was something that struck me in what you were saying there as well, with folks over 55 and looking at what's next and exiting. And one of the big things that comes with an exit can be depression. You sort of sell the business and you lose that sense of purpose. And I think you made a really good point that maybe we don't realize the sense of purpose that's already tied sort of up in the business, and having a conversation with somebody like you and unpacking that and saying, well, what's really important to you in this transition in the next chapter? And that owner actually coming to realize that, do many owners stay on? They would obviously stay on for a while afterwards and be very involved in the business. So you're not losing that sort of sense of purpose through the transition, I guess.
Yeah. And actually that's a beautiful part of this structure, is the owners can stay on at kind of whatever level they want. So we have some owners who say, I'm the CEO, even though I'm doing this owner transition, I want to stay CEO for the next decade. But we have many others who say, I purposely want to step back, but I still want to like be involved. So what they'll keep a seat on the trust stewardship committee or on the operating board of directors. And they can design that for themselves. If they were getting acquired by a company, then they wouldn't be able to like make that choice necessarily.
Yeah.
But we literally have people who write into the trust agreement, there will be a founder's seat on the trust stewardship committee for as long as I'm alive or until I don't want it anymore. Okay. And they can write that in, like Laura Anderson, who we talked about on that other podcast at the seafood company in Oregon. That's what she did. She was
21 Hats.
Yeah. She was the founder CEO, and now she's stepped back, but she's still involved in a couple ways. She's on the trust stewardship committee, and instead of being CEO, she's now part-time CFO. And so she supports them on the finance side, but they have a new CEO. So she still gets to like be involved, have some purpose, avoid kind of post sale depression. And, uh, and I think that's one of the cool things about this structure is these owners can continue to, play a stewardship role at whatever level they think,
Yeah.
they would like. So.
And I get what's your, I mean, you're building a business now. What's your, have you got a strong sense of purpose behind what you're doing at the moment? Is that something you see growing over the next few years, or is it sort of solo consultants?
So Lumo Group, we're focused on helping mission-driven companies with ownership and operations. This whole time we've been talking about the ownership side of our business. We also help companies on the operations side.
Okay.
Specifically, we offer fractional COO services.
Okay.
That's typically for like earlier stage companies. So companies that use our operations services may eventually, grow up to become companies that want to do a trust ownership transition.
Gotcha. Okay.
Down the road. But yes, we have just started like hiring some people, and we're trying to integrate kind of our mission and purpose, from the outset. And so like one thing, like my wife is my business partner, and we have like 2 little kids at home. So we care a lot about having a balanced lifestyle that allows us to, pick up our kids from school, or like if a kid is sick, be able to stay home with them and not stress out. And we want to make sure that anyone we work with, can feel that same sense of balance in their life. So as we're like thinking about how we design the roles for our company and the way that our employees will experience working here, that's going to be something that we're going to be thinking about integrating. But that's in like how we operate. But more broadly, I just get so much joy from helping people who want to do good in this world, who want to run great companies, helping them set up structures that allow them to do that more easily. Every time I help transition a company, I just think of the impact that will have, like, for hopefully decades to come as that company persists in kind of this perpetual form. And the cool thing is I've now had the opportunity to work with companies ranging from 4 million in revenue to 400 million in revenue across all different industries, geographies. And at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of these owners, like, they just want the same thing, which is to, create great places to work, create high quality products or services, and, like, leave their company in a way that when they step back, they can exhale and say, okay, I know that this thing I built, this beautiful thing that I built, will persist. And I can feel really happy about that. So that's why we show up to work every day.
Love it. Yes. One last question then, and I think you've already answered that. Name of the podcast is Freedom Experience. What does freedom mean to you?
Well, for me personally, and I think for probably lots of people, freedom, more than anything, has to do with a sense of ownership and autonomy. And ownership and autonomy are about your life. Yeah. About when you wake up in the morning and you think, how is my day going to unfold? Do you have autonomy in the answer to that question? Do you have ownership in the answer to that question? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't. And they have to clock in to long hours. Then they have to run straight from work to back to their kids. They have to cook dinner, do their kids' bedtime. Maybe they get 30 minutes, 90 minutes to themselves before they have to go to sleep, so they're not exhausted before they do it all again the next day. And it's a lifestyle that is burning out a lot of people.
Thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your story and sharing with the audience. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much, Peter.